Sonya Morton-Firth and you're tuned in to the Sonya Morton-Firth Show. Today my guest is Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley, neuroscientist and expert in cannabis and psychedelics, research director at Heroic Hearts Charity and founder of Hystelica. In this episode we discuss how psychedelics can help women in post and perimenopause and veterans suffering from trauma and PTSD. Grace, hello and welcome. It's lovely to have you here on the show. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to come and talk about my work and talk about the things that you've been covering on this podcast.
Grace, I am super excited to get into everything from your life in terms of being a reservist in the army, and also your research in psychedelics and other plant-based medicines. But before we get going, can you give me a little bit of your background on who you are and what you do today?
Sure. So you kind of mentioned there, I joined the Army Reserve a couple of years ago in the role as an infantry officer, which has been hugely eye-opening in terms of learning a lot about the military and what it really feels like to be part of those teams and acting in a combat role. But that's something that I came to actually later in life. I was nearly 30 by the time I came out of Sandhurst. My primary role has always been as a scientist. So I'm a neuroscientist. I did my PhD at King's College London, where I still am associated now. And the thing that really got me going with neuroscience was just sort of understanding how the brain works, but also really starting to look at what different substances do to the brain. So my PhD, that was largely looking at cannabis and cannabinoid sciences. And then that has slightly evolved, obviously, with the sort of dawning of a new kind of age of psychedelic science. And I was able to sort of be in this incredible position of being a neuroscientist and an Army reservist and step into the role as a research director for an incredible charity called Heroic Hearts Project. We have operations in the US, Canada, and the UK. And we take military veterans, their families, and other first responders through psychedelic retreat programs. And my role in that is to collect research around what we do and look at the effects that we have. And then further to that, I have sort of continued on my never-ending quest for knowledge in terms of psychedelics, and recently started a company myself within the last 2 years that looks specifically at the science of women taking psychedelics and what that really means in terms of not only the sort of added safety requirements there, but also this incredible potential for treating women and women-specific conditions using potentially psychedelic substances.
Wow, Grace, there is so much there that I'm already lighting up. Women and psychedelics, the fact you've been a reservist in the army as a woman in itself as well, that must be quite something as well. Where did your sort of fascination start, though, on the psychedelic front? What sort of drew you to that?
Well, I think it's difficult to not be fascinated by a substance that somebody says, you're going to eat this, mushroom that looks like any other mushroom you've ever eaten in your life. And actually, it's going to make you have a completely transient experience that changes your brain's functioning and potential, whole kind of structure after that process. And it could be the most transient and most meaningful experience of your life. Somebody tells you that as a neuroscientist, you're going to think, well, how? Why? There's so many questions that you need to know more. I certainly was able to get, a lot of that kind of headwind sort of from the work I was doing in cannabis and cannabinoid sciences. And a lot of that work originated from trying to understand the sort of etiology around different mental health conditions, most namely probably psychosis. And sort of saying, well, you know, what is a psychotic state? What does the brain look like then? How could cannabis or cannabinoids, you know, be playing into people developing psychosis, or potentially certain cannabinoids used for treating psychosis? And then once I started to really look at what we knew about psychedelics and the science for that, then of course I was starting to see how these could be applied to treating those mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I, you know, naturally, as a neuroscientist, knew that that was where I wanted to be putting my focus, understanding what those mechanisms are.
So I'd like to go into the work that you're doing specifically as well around veterans, and obviously could then come talk about what you're doing with women that I'm really fascinated about. So what is the history with psychedelics and treating mental health, or actually any health conditions? Is there a long sort of standing history? Because they've obviously been around the planet for donkey's years. Absolutely,
and that's why it's a really interesting place to be as a scientist, because we're new to the science team are new to the party. The party's been going on for a long time. It's kind of funny because sometimes I think, you know, particularly in the Western world, we kind of lead very much with our very Western science of you know, very good systems that we have to make sure that we ensure that things are safe and that we understand how they work and why they work and how to use them. But we kind of have to accept as Western scientists that we are sort of very much in our infancy of understanding these substances. However, there are indigenous cultures all over the planet who have been using these substances for millennia. And we know that. We see it in many existing tribes of South America. And I know you've spoken with others on this podcast who have been to South America and met with those tribes and met with the healers who exist within those tribes and are part of those cultures, these healers, and use substances like ayahuasca, which is a psychedelic that is made from a couple of different plants that grow in the Amazon rainforest. And there are also indigenous tribes in Mexico that do this, in Northern America. But if we bring ourselves back to where we're sitting now, right, in the United Kingdom, I think if we were to really look back in our lineage, you know, pre-Roman times, pre the Catholic Church showing up, right? And we were to look into Celtic cultures, if we were to look into the cultures across Northern Europe, you know, the reindeer herders of Scandinavia, for instance, there's always very obvious connotations with them, and the Amanita muscaria mushroom. There's very good evidence that we have been using these substances in our cultures as part of healing practices for many, many, many years. They just haven't been documented in what we would consider modern medicine, modern science, modern healthcare systems.
Wow, okay, so where then, or how has that been linked then to veterans that suffer from PTSD and trauma, and they've come out of this, and what evidence is there that it actually works, or by taking either psychedelics or MDMA that's helped them?
Well, there's lots of very good evidence now. I would say undisputable evidence now that this MDMA psychedelic assisted therapy and going on these sort of classic psychedelic experiences with psilocybin and ayahuasca have proven to be helpful for thousands of veterans at this point.
So when I hear MDMA, and I know a veteran who's done this, and he's been on a guided MDMA journey, I don't want to say experience, I don't know the right wording, and he had a huge, massive relief from his PTSD. But when I think of MDMA, to me it's like a party drug. You know, it's something that we did back in the 80s. Well, it was made famous in the 80s, the rave scene and all the rest of it. And I don't sort of associate it with overcoming PTSD and trauma.
I would be happy to share a bit of light on some of how that happens. So essentially, to give you a quick kind of piece of the neuroscience, most of these substances largely work on the serotonin system in our brain. Serotonin is that is the neurotransmitter that makes us feel happy, and
we love everyone.
Yeah, very much sort of all the good feelings, right, come around as a result of serotonin. We see kind of low levels of serotonin associated with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we kind of, by having this interaction at the serotonin system, in that moment when people are under the influence of the drug, they have this big influx that makes them feel really good. But one other thing that happens, particularly with MDMA, is you get something where there's a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is responsible for our fear response. And in post-traumatic stress disorder, what we see is overactivation of this particular region, and this region becoming activated at what we would otherwise describe as, salient triggers. So things that, if we were to really rationalize them, we would know that they're not a threat to us, but our body is acting as though they are a threat because it has been preconditioned by this traumatic event that somebody experienced. And often a lot of precursors to that in their lives that have primed their brain to be more alert to these triggers. When we take substances like MDMA and we take substances like psilocybin, not only do we get this kind of increase in serotonin that makes us feel really good, and it also causes this big increase in activation in our brain that allows for more of that kind of thinking to go on, but we also get this dampening down of that fear response from the parts of the brain like the amygdala. And what that means is that a veteran who in a normal situation would not be able to think or begin to describe or talk about and therefore process a traumatic experience is able to do so under the influence of these substances. And in that ability, particularly with MDMA, where it's a lot of talking, they are able to speak about those experiences, or, with classic psychedelics, with psilocybin or ayahuasca, it's not so much talking with a person, it's more of an internal process, talking with yourself. They're able to then go through the necessary steps that the brain requires to take a traumatic memory and to then basically look at it for what it is and then file it away in the correct cupboard under, okay, no, that's no longer a threat to me. I don't need to now be continually vigilant for that thing. And that's what somebody needs in order to heal from a traumatic experience and no longer kind of go through the, re-traumatizing when they become triggered. And
so I guess that's almost years of psychology or counselling. Yeah. In I guess one session. Does it take one session, 2 sessions, or is it?
Well, for MDMA assisted psychotherapy, there are protocols out there. It's normally sort of 10 sessions, 4 of which would be under the influence of MDMA. But for things like ayahuasca or psilocybin, these things are more often done in more of those traditional settings, and so you would talk about it in terms of going through a ceremony. So that would be taking a large dose of one of these substances and being in a ceremony that sometimes can be quite a clinical setting. Sometimes it can be in the middle of a jungle with a shaman and the drumming and all the rest of it. And sometimes people go through just one of those experiences and it's enough, whereas other people acknowledge that that's the first step in a journey of them maybe going through a few of those processes. It can be different for everyone, and it's not necessarily almost in correlation to the sort of size of trauma. Many of these traumas are something that happened to people on top of the previous life they've led that has sort of set them up to be a candidate for developing PTSD. So it can be more about that pre-traumatizing experience than the size of the trauma itself.
So are you talking about trauma that's locked actually in the cells or in the...
Well, funny you say that. It kind of is that, yes. We now understand a lot more. We obviously have genes, genes in terms of our DNA that we can't change, but we do have something called epigenetics, which is where we essentially, through chemical changes to the outside of the DNA, different things that happen to us in our lives. It's an evolutionary thing. We're very, very smart organisms built to survive. We are able to adapt to our environment, change the way we express our genes so that we are most suited for the environment of which we're living.
Because you hear of Holocaust survivors that have passed on certain epigenetics, I guess, through what they've been through, and then similarly it's passed on to sort of their
this idea of inherited trauma, like when you first hear it, it sounds a bit woo-woo crazy, like, oh yeah, sure, it's my ancestors. But actually, when you look at it, there's very good science there. And if up until your maternal grandmother, there's good evidence of how that stress would be passed down genetically to you. But even just taking yourself, for instance, if you were a small child growing up in an environment where you didn't feel safe, be that for any reason, not getting looked after, having some kind of trauma applied to you at that age, many different reasons that children cannot feel safe. And that will affect the way your genes are expressing, and your brain is growing at this time. So if you are really stressed out and you're like 3-4 years old, then your brain is going to grow in a way that's like, okay, we live in quite a stressful environment and in a stressful time. And so your brain will develop in that sense. And those are the kind of things which predispose you to then, if you say, leave home at 18, go off, join the military, then go off to war, see these traumatic experiences, your brain is then more likely to develop what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder.
That is so interesting, because I interviewed a lot of veterans, and some who, and I've got veterans who are friends of mine as well, some who suffer from PTSD and some who don't. And I always was trying to figure out in my own mind, well, why is it that some suffer, even though they've both had the same similar sort of experience, they've both been on tour, seen the same horrific scenes, but one person has walked away with PTSD and one hasn't. But that just, and yet when I've delved down deeper into their stories, it makes total sense. Those that have maybe not had the greatest of backgrounds because of childhood trauma are those the ones that have suffered from PTSD. Where my best friend, for example, who is a veteran, has had a great childhood in terms of loving parents, and he hasn't suffered from PTSD. So maybe that's...
So childhood trauma is actually one of the leading sort of correlations with people developing post-traumatic stress disorder. The other one, just to mention, is traumatic brain injuries, which happen an awful lot in the military. So, that's having any kind of physical injury to your head. And that obviously can look like smacking your head on something, which can happen as you're jumping in and out of vehicles and in the sort of heavy sort of fighting that goes on. But a lot of that head trauma can also come about by just being very close to explosive force, which people in the military, if you're in the artillery, for instance, you're hearing quite a few bangs a day, and that is a wave of energy that is passing through your brain. So that can also affect some of the structures and functioning of the brain, and also predispose things like PTSD.
So what we're saying is that these plant-based medicines can actually help, and please, if I'm getting the wording wrong, please say, rewire the brain?
Yeah, so there's a number of different mechanisms by which these substances work. I spoke a little about, particularly in the context of MDMA and with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, this idea of you being able to talk it out and reprocess what that trauma looks like. But I guess there's a few different kind of levels of which it works. Part of it is that side. It's that sort of psychology side of it, if we call it that. And if we, transfer that into, more of the work I do, which is with heroic hearts, so we use more ayahuasca and psilocybin in our treatments. And what people come out of those big experiences is these transient experiences where you're, for the observer, for me, I just see you lie down on a mat for 6 hours. But when these veterans come out, they're like, oh my gosh, I went here, I saw this, I spoke to my mom, I, was able to realize that this behavior. And they have these huge downloads, is what people call them, I suppose. These incredible insights that they are able to get about themselves, be that about their behaviors, be that about who they are when they show up in society, who they are when they show up for their families. And that is a large part of what people get out of it. This very psychological experience in terms of what they learn about the world and about themselves. But let's just take it down a step from there and talk about it on a functional part. I am looking, I'm a neuroscientist. I don't care about what your experience was like. I want to see what your brain looks like. If I look at the brain scans that we see with psychedelics, is we see this lighting up of the brain in that different parts of the brain start talking to each other that don't normally talk to each other. And that's because our brain has a sort of hierarchy, and there's parts of the brain that basically kind of dictate which parts are going to be used. And in symptoms like PTSD, we see that these systems that can be very kind of controlling become much more rigid. And basically you get a kind of reduction in that sort of free flow of ideas, free flow of functionality in the brain. When we take psychedelics, we get a big influx of this functionality, and it's almost a bit like if you imagine drawing channels of water on a sand beach, and you get sort of one, and all the water keeps going down one, and it just gets deeper and deeper, and it gets hard for that water to flow anywhere else. But if a big wave comes and washes over it all, that channel then kind of loses its importance, and other channels are free to flow. And that's what we see under psychedelics. And it's not just in the acute stage. We see that lasting for a little bit longer afterwards. And then dropping down from the functional, let's talk on the structural level. We then know that as a result of these substances being in the body, we get an increase of things like brain-derived BDNF, it's called. It's basically miracle grow for neurons and for the brain. We see a huge influx of that, which means for the weeks after you've taken the substance, your brain has these, more of the things it needs to grow, to make new connections. And even one step down from that, on a genetic level, we see increase of these transcription factors, they're called, that basically tell the genes to make more proteins, make more things we need to make more brain connections. So on all these different levels, from you getting the download and the insight and the psychological to your genes getting the, hey, come on, it's time to wake up. Wow. We see these substances interacting with our neurology.
Wow, I'm absolutely flabbergasted, having tried psilocybin a number of times, and having recently had an ayahuasca experience. I certainly can understand the downloads. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I wasn't aware quite how it affected the body from a physiological state afterwards. So, but I loved your metaphor there of the sand and the beach, because it sort of explains so much. Yeah. So I guess that would lead me to the next thing to say, okay, so first of all, this is not legal in the UK. Mm-hmm. It's not like I can go down to the shop and say, hey, give me a dose of ayahuasca or to Boots and go, listen, I'm not feeling free-flowing or creative today. Give me some mushrooms. But part of the thing that I experienced, I'm not sure can just be given in a pill, or if you can extract this stuff from a plant and given in a sort of an oral form, because it was very much about the ceremony and the spiritual side of things, which is very difficult to explain to somebody logically from you're a scientist. I mean, you must how do you explain this to other scientific members? I guess things have changed. Sorry, I'm sort of throwing it.
And some of my scientific peers do look at me like I've grown another head when I start talking to them. And even when I first started working for Heroic Hearts, I remember sitting down with the wonderful team at Imperial College, who we do a lot of our research with, and discussing what we wanted to have in the protocol. And I was like, right, I want a measure of anxiety and a measure of this. And they said, well, we need to have, some kind of measure of the mystical experience. And I was like, no, we don't. This is all a load of rubbish. And the more I'm learning, the more time I'm spending around people who are using these medicines, because they are medicines, I realize that component, that mystical experience, the whole package, how did you get to the retreat? What was the preparation you did before you arrived there? What was the space like when you were there? What did the facilitators do? How did they make you feel safe when you were in the experience? What did you do when you came out? How did you integrate what you learned back into your life? All of that is part of it. It's not just about that point, like you say, where you ingest the substance. And I think we have a very Western part of society where we just take those 2 pills twice a day and you'll be fine. We have this kind of sort of pharmaceutical image of taking medicine, and not about it being this more holistic practice. And in my experience, and from what I've seen, and from what we try and do at Heroic Hearts, so through Heroic Hearts program, we don't just fire people off into the jungle and say,
talk me through a sort of, it'd be a great point to just, could you talk me through what, in terms of a practical side, what you would do at Heroic Hearts? Because if there are veterans listening, or people that know people that maybe could benefit from this, what's the sort of experience?
Absolutely. So what we do firstly was, we get people to apply to us to kind of say that they wanted to do this and are ready to kind of go through this journey, and most usually that's people who've normally been through various other treatment programs that have not been successful for them, but it's not a requirement at all for us to speak with people. First of all, we do a safety check to make sure that they're a suitable candidate. These are new substances, and we do want to make sure that everyone who goes through the process is appropriate for it, and there are some contradictions to using these substances. But on completion of that, and once we kind of say, yeah, no, you're a good candidate for this, you would enter into a period of preparation. Now, for us, what that looks like is Heroic Hearts will assign to you a coach who most likely, and this is the wonderful thing that we've been able to achieve with having taken so many through the program, most likely is a veteran who went through the program themselves and got something really transformative out of it, and has now been through our
forward, yes.
And then we put them into a coaching program and they learn how to be coaches themselves. But you would have, 3 calls with your coach before, and they would talk a bit about some of the practicalities of what the experience might be like. If you have never experienced expanding consciousness before, it can be quite overwhelming. You probably need 1 or 2 kind of, this is what it could feel like, here's some breathing practices, here's some things that you might want to start thinking of ahead of time. What is your intention for coming? What could be things that are going to come up for you? And they might not, but they might, be ready for that. And then we also have a series of group calls. So all of the other veterans who are going to be on that retreat with you, you'll meet before for a couple of group calls where you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about why you're there, and that really starts that group bonding that I personally think is incredibly important, particularly in veteran healing. You know, we don't operate as single units when we're in, so I think potentially our healing is within operating in groups again to help us in that healing process. Once that preparation's been done, you would then go out to the retreat site, which at the moment are all retreats in jurisdictions where these practices are completely legal. So that could be in the Netherlands using psilocybin, could be in South America using ayahuasca, or Mexico, or now we have sites in Oregon in America. And at that retreat program, Heroic Hearts would have a representative there who is most likely a veteran who's been through the process before, but primarily that site and that retreat would be run by a pre-vetted and well-regarded facilitation team that Heroic Hearts has chosen. And that will normally be somebody who's going to be leading the ceremonies and someone who is leading the program, and then a set of other people who are facilitators, who to some intents and purposes, job is just to sit there and hand you a tissue when you need it. But other times, you know, they're needed to help hold that space and hold everyone safe in that space. The retreat programs are normally between sort of 5 days and a week. Normally 2 to 3 ceremonies will happen during that time, alongside other practices, talking, you know, in group circles, maybe doing some yoga, spending time in nature. All of these things that, you know, as human beings are actually very, very normal things, but aren't actually things we really do in our everyday lives. And then after you leave that retreat, you know, we always kind of say that's the start of your journey, right? You get these downloads on the retreat and then you have to take them and go forward to live the rest of your life. And so we, for the 4 weeks after, maintain that contact in terms of 3 more sessions with your individualized coach and then a number of other group sessions. And then from that point, you are forever in the family. I am on a bunch of different Signal and WhatsApp groups with whole retreats that I was able to go and collect research data on. And I see these, you know, guys and girls years later, still checking in, still, hey, you know what, I had a rough day the other day. Don't worry, I've got you. What was it? Give me a call. And they support each other in their journeys going forward with this.
And what have you seen on firstly on a scientific level? Do you look at looking at their brains afterwards? So that sounds a bit technical, but are you measuring what their brains look like before and afterwards? What are you seeing there?
So we've done a little bit of that using EEG machines. We're able to look at the way that the brain functions, and that's some of what my job has been in the last few years. We had a very specific focus with some retreats we ran with the Beckley retreats in Jamaica, and we took veterans who'd had traumatic brain injuries and we looked at the difference of their brain functioning as a result of this, and we were able to see some of what I just sort of described, this idea that these sort of very rigid brainwaves associated with post-traumatic stress disorder seem to get less, and the brainwaves that are more to do with creativity and cognitive thought became more. But we also look at what are sort of clinically validated measures of things like depression, anxiety, sleep, post-traumatic stress disorder, quality of life. And I've been running that study now for 3 years. You know, we've got over 60 plus sets of data in from veterans who've been through the process. And, you know, the statistical significance of the effect of these programs is far more than is seen with some of the best antidepressants out there, some of the most gold standard post-traumatic stress disorder, cognitive behavioral therapy programs. We are seeing undeniably, in terms of, you know, cold, hard data, this helps, this works. And it's not just that we're seeing people's symptoms got a bit better. People are no longer meeting diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder, having gone through these programs.
Do you know where we are with legislation here in the UK, how we can push this forward?
Unfortunately, a bit of a rut, it seems. There are a number of organisations who are trying to speak with the government and particularly bring about the, on the veteran side, or in the case of people in sort of end of life care, there is an urgent need, and there should be a case for compassionate use for these people. But the UK government, on sort of last I checked, there was a petition put forward to the government to ask for them to look again at these laws and look if we could change the scheduling of the substances so they could be better researched. But also we could potentially look at people not having to travel outside of the country to go and use these substances. And the government said that there was, not enough evidence had been brought about for them to see the need to review a lot of this. Unfortunately, that seems to be the only place that this particular government wants to go with it. I'm sure that we will potentially have a new government by the end of the year, though they are not being particularly promising either in their desire to look again at these things.
But hey, go and knock yourself out with loads of alcohol and cigarettes, because
Yeah,
they're both legal and the most harmful things out there.
Right.
Okay. I'd like to change tack now and get onto your own business that's true to your heart, your business on Hystelica.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about that and how you are helping women?
Absolutely. So Hystelica was really brought about because I, being a scientist, wanting to find out, why all the time, I started to hear some kind of stories from women who'd used psychedelics and potentially had noticed some change in their menstrual cycle afterwards, or, even changes to do with the anxiety they were feeling around fertility, for instance. And after that, they had spoken to me, I decided to dig into the literature and kind of find out, well, why were they experiencing these things? And I realized, as I'm sure maybe you said you had covered a bit on Women's Health before, there was nothing there. Nobody had been looking at this. And not only had nobody really been looking at how psychedelics might affect women's bodies, but I then, rather ashamedly, in my early 30s as a woman, started to realize we really don't actually know very much about women's bodies at all. And we really don't teach women about women's bodies, and we don't teach our physicians about women's bodies. So I was furious, and I did what every furious woman does. And I decided I was going to...
redhead as well.
I decided I was going to start a company about it. So I started Hystelica. Our primary focus is that we are dedicated to understanding what safe and effective psychedelic use is in women's bodies. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that is really important. Now, one of them being that women have hormones that fluctuate throughout our lives, be that, monthly fluctuations with the menstrual cycle, or be that, post-menopause when we lose the presence of a lot of hormones. And those hormones, we always have been taught, well, they just control whether you're having a baby or not, right? Well, actually, no. We now understand those hormones are incredibly powerful neurosteroids. They change the way our brain thinks. You speak to a woman every day for 28 days, she'll be a slightly different woman every day. And this is the kind of madness of it, in that we do understand with psychedelics that the mindset and who you are in the moment when you take the psychedelics can be really impactful on the journey that you might have. But yet there didn't seem to be, in any of the clinical applications or move to clinical applications for psychedelics, people taking too much notice of that. The fact that the fluctuations in female hormones may be impactful in terms of that person's journey or their healing journey with using psychedelics. So that's the primary point for why I think Hystelica is very important. But the other point is that we have an awful lot of conditions out there for which for the same reason for military veterans and PTSD. There's a lot of conditions in women's health that are under-researched and there's very, very poor treatment options for. Menopause, for instance. The UK guidelines just came out and said, maybe you should go and try some more talking therapy. Maybe that's why you're hot
having
flushing.
just been through the menopause or going through, not quite sure yet. I did so much research, and thank God I love doing my research, and I actually went to my doctor and said, no, this is what I want, X, Y, Z. This is not normal. This is not just me having a bad day, or take a headache pill, or whatever it is, or take an SRI, take an antidepressant. So many women are being put on antidepressants for something
which
that
is shocking.
Just absolutely disgusting.
Absolutely disgusting and shocking, because it's not the appropriate treatment at all. It doesn't really it doesn't get to the underlying mechanisms of what are going on here. And the reason I bring this up, so things like menopause, things like, PMDD, people who have, very, very severe PMS to the point where they're almost suicidal once a month. And the treatment options for these are very poor. If we look at psychedelics, if we look at the mechanisms, and if we, apply a bit of a women's biology focus and context to it, you can start to see there may be some really incredible opportunities from these substances where they could be used for women to help with these conditions. Be that, I'm about to start a study at the moment that's looking at people who are using microdoses of psychedelics. That's sub-perceptual doses. You're not kind of hallucinating and all the
funny
rest
you say
of it.
that. I did a whole summer last year, not a whole summer, I did a couple of months of microdosing with a tiny amount of psilocybin. I think it's 0.0. I mean, you're not, there is no visuals. You don't feel like you would normally do under psychedelics. They're really...
you don't require a shaman to
No,
be next to you.
there is nothing like that. And, and I kept a sort of a spreadsheet with my different feelings, anxiety, how was my anxiety, how was my focus, my creativity, all of these different things. And I sort of marked myself out of 10 over the summer. Oh, wow. And what I found was, because I train, I'm very much into my training. Of course, train like a little man. I was quite interested in what you just said. We're all little men, really, because that's how...
we're not little men.
Exactly. That's why it's quite funny. But I found I was much more focused in the gym. And I could, my training sessions were a lot better.
Yeah, a lot of people really report that they get much better, what's the word, perception of each individual kind of muscle moving.
Yes, the mind-body connection is a lot stronger, I found that.
Yeah, hugely. But, when we look at so let's look at estrogen, and we look at the mechanisms of estrogen, which is this powerful neurosteroid that acts on the serotonin system and also is a very powerful anti-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory in the brain. So when that goes away in menopause, you get a lot of symptoms of having sort of reduced serotonin system functioning, and you also get these symptoms of increased neuroinflammation. Well, psilocybin goes in, works to increase serotonin system functioning, and works to decrease inflammation in the brain. So could there be a mechanism by which a microdose of psilocybin, for instance, could then alleviate some of those symptoms of menopause brought about by the reduction of estrogen? I don't know. The science is yet to be fully, played out and discovered. But what I'm trying to do is say, hey, I really think we need to be looking at this and considering it.
And where are you with your studies? Is there any way we can help you, Grace, on this journey? Because I'm fascinated by it. And not only as a woman and somebody that also believes in the benefits of things that are put here on our planet. And I've only ever seen amazing things, and I believe it does increase our openness and our creativity, and could lead to a much more loving society at a fundamental level. Is there anything we can do to help?
Well, maybe there's more. I'll frame it this way. Maybe there's more that I could potentially do to help some of your listeners out there. When I started this company, with one arm, I wanted it to be holding the industry to standard and making sure that women's biology is important and is considered as we develop these new medicines using psychedelics, because, you know, women have been chronically ignored in the development of almost every other drug that exists. Let's not let it happen again here. But the other arm of my company is kind of reaching out to those women for whom this may be part of their journey. This may be something that they are starting to think about. So if that is you listening to this and you're thinking about maybe wanting to find out more about these substances and understand potentially, could this be helpful for you or not? You know, please do follow us on Instagram. The handle is We Are Hystelica. We also have a website. We're starting to develop more of that offering to try and educate women a little bit more about their bodies, a little bit more about these substances, and a little bit more about the decision-making process that they might need to go through before coming to using these things.
And we'll definitely put those links in the show notes. What is the future? Where do you see your future? Where can you see this going?
I mean, who knows? Who knows? For me, I just know that I've been incredibly lucky. Not every person gets to find their purpose in life, and to have found my purpose in life at such a young age. When I was training in the military, I remember having this, you know, a number of those moments, you know, early morning, having crawled out of my DOS bag and looking over some incredible landscape and thinking, wow, I'm so lucky because I have such a purpose in being here. And now I get that to be every day of my life, because I wake up and I know that the work that I'm doing with Heroic Hearts and with Hystelica is that. I don't know where it's taking me, but I'm not sure that matters right now. What I'm just trying to do is bring good, solid, rigorous science around these substances so that I can communicate effectively, be that to military veterans in need, be that to, you know, the countless women who are probably feeling exhausted, burnt out, tired, you know, lacking in their purpose and direction, and give them some clear guidance in terms of what they could do, so that I can be, you know, in service in some way to them, for them to sort of go and live their best life, as it were. I'm hoping that Hystelica is going to grow more and more. As I said, we have this project coming along for microdosing and the menopause. We actually have been able to partner with MAPS, which is a big American organization who've been working for a very long time in psychedelics. And through them, we're able to accept charitable donations to assist us with our microdosing study. So I'm hoping that we're going to start to kind of be able to bring in more of this kind of funding and support so that I can expand the research. So we won't just be looking at microdosing and menopause, but hopefully further down the line start to explore more treatment potential for women. And that's where I hope it will all take me, but who knows? Who knows?
Grace, thank you so much
for
being a guest on my show. Thank you. It's been great.